I think we're ready to get started. I'm Dan Bobb. I'm a visiting scholar here at SAIS, and thank you all for coming on a rainy afternoon. Really appreciate it. And I want to begin by thanking our co-sponsors here today, the U.S.-Japan Institute, which has been very generous funding the program and helping coordinate this. I think we've assembled a really terrific group of speakers today on what I think is an important and interesting topic, how the state of U.S.-China relationship is affecting and influencing U.S.-Japan ties. And we're going to look at this sort of through a lens from Capitol Hill. Now, there have always been ups and downs in the U.S.-China relationship, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that we're facing some very serious challenges in the U.S.-China relationship, and probably really the most serious in the 40 years since the two countries established diplomatic relations. It's also a little bit difficult to see how those relations are going to improve anytime soon, since in many respects, I think both countries are viewing the relationship in sort of zero-sum terms. And that kind of leaves Japan caught in the middle between its neighbor and very important economic partner, China, as well as between its alliance partner, the United States. We're going to explore these issues, developments in U.S.-China and U.S.-Japan relations in two panels. And the first is going to be on trade and economics, and the second on security and foreign policy. So I'm going to turn things over to the moderator for the first panel, Mieko Nakabayashi. You should all have copies of bios, but Mieko-san is a professor at Waseda University. She also served in the Diet from 2009 to 2012, and she's been a friend of mine for many years, going back to the 90s, when both of us served in the U.S. Senate together. So with that, Mieko-san, it's over to you.
Thank you, Dan, for the generous introduction. Again, my name is Mieko Nakabayashi. We thought this session is going to be very unique, even in Washington, because these days the world is focusing on administration and Mr. Trump so much. However, somewhat congressional perspective is lacking. And we thought Congress is even more important than ever in this environment and international relations. And as a first panel, we have excellent panelists. I can't dream for more than this. And we have only 1 hour to discuss everything regarding U.S.-China relations, impacts on Japan, as well as congressional perspective. Therefore, I'd like to ask you to read the bio, please, to save the time. And I think I'm almost done to bring all these excellent panelists together here. And I will be listening to 3 panelists' remarks at the beginning, 10 minutes each. And then we'll discuss about important issues for 30 minutes. I think this is about all for the procedure. First, let me ask former congressman from Louisiana, Republican, Charles Bostany, and then maybe I should call everyone so that we can go pretty quickly. It's Ken Levinson, Executive Director, Washington International Trade Association. He's the guru of international trade in Washington. And Paul Strasik, Professor of Youngstown State University. He actually stayed in Japan for a year under Fulbright exchange program and was in Tokyo a week or so. So he knows about U.S.-Japan relations in terms of trade very well. Okay, please, Charles, go first.
Well, thank you, Mieko. It was a pleasure to be here with you and to join our fellow panelists. Good afternoon, everybody. So let me offer some observations about the U.S.-China relationship and where this may be going based on current policy, and offer some ideas about where it might go that could be that could put us ultimately in a better place. And when I say us, I'm talking about the United States, our friends in Japan, and of course allies around the world who believe in a liberal, open economic order. So as you all know, China in the 1990s began to really accelerate their reform efforts, but under the careful, watchful eyes of the Chinese Communist Party leadership in a run-up to joining or acceding to the WTO. And at that time, that debate was very heated, and there was a lot of opposition to China's accession to the WTO. But ultimately, China did accede to the WTO and was granted permanent normalized trade relations by the United States in 2001. Much of what drove that decision was very consistent with post-Cold War thinking, that economic liberalization, integration into the global trading order would lead to economic reforms in China. A burgeoning middle class would emerge, and more pressure would mount for political reforms. But since accession to the WTO, what we've seen is a slowing of the reform effort, and arguably since 2013, that reform effort has really gone into reverse. The Trump administration came into office thinking that it was time to change the approach and to take a much more coercive, much more head-on direct approach in dealing with U.S.-China relations. But if you go back and do careful analysis, concerns were beginning to mount in the second term of the Bush administration. And then following that, certainly in the Obama administration. And in fact, 19 of 23 WTO cases were brought forward against China on a whole range of issues that we're still complaining about today during those two administrations. So one can argue that this transition to a more firm confrontational approach was beginning even back then. But even with that, the Trump administration became much more disenamored with the initial attempts to just continue dialogue. And if you remember in the first year, they tried to do some, change the structure of the dialogue, but it quickly pivoted, quickly changed into a more confrontational position, which I've given the term for the Trump approach, I call it unilateral coercive measures coupled with broader protectionism, directed not only toward China, but also with other countries. And so this coercive approach, basically a coercive approach to decouple our economies, is what we're seeing. Now, as the Trump administration ratcheted up that pressure with successive tiers of tariffs and elevating those tariffs, what ended up happening was we started to see tremendous headwinds across the country. It started off in the agricultural sector, where we started to see a number of farms teetering on bankruptcy because of loss of market share from retaliation. In fact, we've seen a record number of farm bankruptcies around the country. But this also expanded more widely into the manufacturing sector. A lot of small companies in the heartland of America were having supply chain difficulties. And what ended up happening was Congress was starting to really gripe about this quite a bit, but yet members of Congress didn't really know what an alternative approach would be. And they're still grappling with this. What should the strategy be with regard to U.S.-China relations? Now, as the Trump administration went through its successive rounds of tariffs, these headwinds got much worse. We saw a real decline in the stock market. A number of other economic indicators were becoming problematic, and advisors to the administration were saying, hey, you got to back off of this. And I believe that was the impetus for the Phase 1 deal. And in fact, it sort of unmasked this inconsistency in the Trump administration approach within the administration. There are those who want to take a much harder view and really decouple our economies. And then there's another grouping in the administration that wants a more transactional deal. Well, what the president opted for was to minimally lower some tariffs in the tier 3 group to get to a deal, but he had to do it for political purposes because there were some who were concerned that the economic headwinds would affect his reelection prospects. He was hearing this from Congress. He was hearing it from others, some elements in the administration. This phase 1 deal basically is a transactional deal. It's focused heavily on some manufacturing, energy exports, and agricultural exports. And a careful review of the numbers, putting aside the issues surrounding coronavirus right now, many of these targets that they've laid out may not be achievable within the short time frame that the administration has pushed. And so I think the Chinese have figured out that the problem here is that they know Trump has a limitation with how far he can go with the tariffs. So the Chinese were willing to make the concessions, but I don't think we'll see any structural changes, even in intellectual property, which was heavily discussed within the agreement, the phase 1 agreement. The problem is, ultimately, the enforcement mechanism falls back on tariffs, and that's a self-limited approach. So I think this is basically, China's approach is basically built into its mercantilist-Leninist system, which directs its type of state capitalism. The party is not going to go so far as to completely liberalize because it would threaten its monopoly on power domestically. And so we're going to need a new approach. And I think it becomes clear to me as I've read through a lot of this and studied the situation, we have seen a gradual erosion in consensus underpinning the global trading system. And this started back in the 1970s with the emergence of non-tariff barriers. More recently, we're seeing new forms of protectionism. And then throwing on top of that, new emerging and foundational technology that requires standards internationally have become more of an issue. And when that consensus breaks down, then economic policy, which is a form of foreign policy, a very important form of foreign policy, the consensus breaks down. The only alternative to keep some semblance of peace is basically coming from international relations theory, balance of power. And so I think we're rapidly moving into a balance of power scenario driven by economics and driven by technological innovation. So U.S. policy, instead of taking punitive approaches that creates a lot of collateral damage domestically and puts our friends in Asia, like Japan and Korea and other countries, in a real difficult dilemma of having to choose between the allure of a Chinese market and the economics of that on one hand, and then on the other hand, the concerns about security and the need for strong alliances with the United States. This is a very difficult position to put allies in. So looking at a balance of power scenario driven by economics and innovation in technology, a better approach is to use very high standard trade and investment agreements, first off, set the standards really high for trade and investment, make it open architecture, use quiet, consistent, collaborative diplomacy with our allies, with China, not bashing them over the head, but basically saying, this is open architecture. You can join if you can meet the standards which will be enforceable. Secondly, we should combine efforts with allies to look at collaborative ways to do investment screening to minimize vulnerabilities. And then thirdly, what we need to do is coordinate our efforts internationally with our allies who believe in a liberal open order. We should cooperate through all the different standard-setting bodies, from the UN all the way down to commercial bodies. China is dominating that space now, and they're going to continue to try to dominate that space because we're largely asleep at the wheel on this. And I think by working in that area, we're doubling down on the liberal economic order, an open architecture system that will put pressure on China to reform, or ultimately, because of the balance of power playing out in economics, as that balance of power begins to shift through consolidation of global value chains, trade and investment agreements, what we will end up seeing is a situation where China is either choosing to continue back onto a path for reform, or it will be choosing self-isolation, or at least, at the very least, unfavorable terms for its state-owned enterprises and other commercial entities. I believe this is the way to align business interest with our allies and domestic support across the United States for a long-term strategy to deal with the challenge posed by China. Thank you.
Thank you for depicting of the entire picture first, and please.
Thank you, Miyoko-san and Charles. It's always a pleasure to be at any event with you. You demonstrate, I think, a level of intellectual curiosity and interest that we don't always see from members of Congress, and really delighted to be here. And Paul, it's a pleasure to meet you, and glad to be here with you as well. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the executive director of a group called the Washington International Trade Association. I know you have my bio, but I just want to say a brief bit about my organization because our organization is a bipartisan group. Our members come from Democrats, Republicans, people who are pro-trade, people who are more protectionists. There are companies and associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, companies like Toyota, Walmart, Boeing are all members of my organization, but we also have members of trade unions and companies that benefit from President Trump's tariffs as part of our group. Also, members of our group come from the United States government, from the administration, from Congress, from embassies. They all have different interests in trade, and as an organization, we don't take positions on issues, but we are pro-trade. So today I'm not going to focus on China, which Charles did, but talk about more on the overall U.S. trade agenda, as well as some specific issues related to the World Trade Organization, where I think there may be some opportunities for the United States and Japan to work together. I can say, I'm going to make a prediction today, and I don't know if it's being videoed, but if you can play it back in several months, I think I'll be able to say in some certainty that we are not going to hear President Trump say anything negative about the Phase 1 deal with China this year. I don't think he's going to say that the new USMCA is the worst trade agreement that was ever negotiated. I think we're going to have a victory tour on those issues in 2020 from the president. But I do think in 2020 we're going to see two dominant themes for trade in the last year of Trump 1. We can get into the politics of that if there's a Trump 2 coming later. The two themes I see are de-escalation and expect to see more micro deals with countries who are looking to avoid trade tensions with the Trump administration. This is sort of like the Phase 1 deal with China, the agreements with Japan and Korea. And I would say that even the USMCA was a micro deal compared to the TPP, which it was based on. Where I do think we're going to see an escalation of tensions is with the European Union and the World Trade Organization. President Trump has wanted to train his fire on Europe for the past 3 years, not just for the past 3 years, but all the way back to 1990. He gave an interview in Playboy magazine then, and he said he wanted to put a tariff on every German car, every Mercedes and BMW coming into the United States. So today he's pressing the EU to negotiate by threatening tariffs on European autos, the same way he did with Japanese autos before. There was a Commerce Department report that was issued last year, but no one has seen it. It was buried in the Commerce Department, and they have passed the statutory deadline that they can act on that report already. But they still haven't released it, and they are still threatening potentially to put tariffs on European autos, and are continuing to explore ways to do that, whether or not through the 232 process that they did before, or other measures that they may consider. So I don't think we're going to see that threat go away, and I think for the German auto companies, they should copy what the Japanese auto companies did. They were very smart. They activated their constituencies in the states where they have production, in places like Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia. Japanese auto companies have 90,000 U.S. direct employees, and they operate in 28 states. And they had a lot of pressure, I think, they were able to put on members of Congress to push back on the Trump administration. And I think I would advise the German auto companies to do the same in the states where they have a lot of production. Where we are going to probably see some activities, maybe even relatively soon, is about a U.S.-UK trade agreement. I think, given past history, what the Trump administration did with Japan and with Korea, it likely would, I think it's more likely that we see a sort of phase one U.S.-UK deal rather than a comprehensive trade agreement. A comprehensive trade agreement has all sorts of notification procedures involved, all sorts of consultations with Congress involved. It would require the UK to engage in a very deep discussion about agriculture, about GMOs, about things that are very difficult to have that conversation, things that would be hard for Prime Minister Johnson to be able to do. So I think we could see potentially a phase one deal with the UK, and possibly something with the EU that would also be maybe a regulatory agreement of some sort. Something that they could get done in 2020 and be able to show some success on without trying to have a full-on trade negotiation, which can take many years. The other big priority I'd flag for the United States and for the U.S. Trade Representative is reform at the World Trade Organization. I worked with the person who's the U.S. Trade Representative, Bob Lighthizer. I worked with very closely in the 1990s. I know Bob very well, and I have a deep and abiding respect for him. I actually think I can honestly say he's probably the best cabinet official that Trump has, and I think we're all lucky that he's the person in that job, to be honest. He's also a true believer in the agenda that Trump has. He actually wrote an article almost 10 years ago, I think, titled "Why Trump is Right on Trade." So he has been pursuing these themes for many years, all the way back to the 1980s when Bob was the deputy U.S. Trade Representative and was addressing some of the issues that the United States at that time had with Japan. And some of the voluntary restraint agreements and the semiconductor agreement and the Plaza Accord were all done in the 1980s under President Reagan, and Bob was one of the principal architects of that. So today, the United States, as many of you may know, is blocking the appointment of appellate judges to the judges to the appellate body at the World Trade Organization. But the issues with the dispute settlement understanding, which again Bob raised to me when I was a Hill staffer with Dan, by the way, working on the Uruguay round to get the United States to join the World Trade Organization. The issues of U.S. sovereignty that he was concerned about with the appellate body were ones he was raising before the United States even entered the World Trade Organization. He actually was far-sighted in those concerns. But the concerns today go beyond the appellate body. That's the focus of everybody's attention. Regular disputes are still actually being filed and taking place. It's just that there's no appeal process right now. But there are other issues, and it comes back to the things Charles was talking about, because China is actually sort of the big issue that is at the forefront of a number of the concerns that the United States has at the WTO these days, starting with the fact that the organization itself was not created to deal with non-market economies. It was created to deal with market economies. Related to that, there are issues related to self-declaration of developing status. Countries can take exceptions at the WTO to certain provisions if they don't want to follow them by claiming they're still developing. The good news is some countries have graduated from that recently. The Trump administration takes pride in that. Korea and Brazil are two recent ones. I was told this morning in a meeting that another country is going to say that it will no longer call itself developing for purposes of those rules in the next week or two. So that's another issue. Another issue, again, that goes back to China, again, is the ability to track and enforce illegal subsidies, which is a problem for state-owned enterprises, another big problem at the WTO. And then, of course, the appellate body issues which relate to the United States and the concerns of others that they make rulings that expand the obligations that the countries have made and that were not pre-negotiated. So the interesting thing, back again to China, is the best way to deal with these larger structural problems in China China and with the WTO is for the United States to work with its allies like Japan, as well as countries like the EU, Canada, Australia. The problem is, because of the Trump administration's threats on things like tariffs on autos, there is what I think is being called a trust deficit. So countries are concerned about agreements they reach and how well they'll be enforced and how well they'll be followed through on by the United States itself. It's not something that is we've faced in the past with the United States leadership at the World Trade Organization and in multilateral institutions. So I think my recommendation for Japan is to work with the United States to help solve some of these problems, including some of the issues with China. That if Japan and the EU were to work with the United States, I think that would be good for both governments to be able to show President Trump that they're willing to cooperate and be helpful with him in these multilateral institutions, which would be a good idea. So if President Trump wins re-election, I think we'll probably see a few things next year. As I said, I don't think you'll be seeing a lot of criticism of the Phase 1 deal from the administration, but I think they will be looking for a Phase 2 negotiation with China. Right now, the Chinese are happy not to negotiate anything else. So I think we won't be seeing anything on that in 2020, but I think we will in 2021. Can the Europeans keep the trade talks moving just fast enough to keep the auto tariffs from happening? There's some critical dates coming up. There's a decision that's going to be made about European counter-retaliation on Boeing Airbus that'll be coming later in the spring. After that, we may be able to see some possible thawing in the relationship if there's some concessions that can be made, maybe an agreement on Boeing Airbus, maybe some sort of regulatory agreement between the United States and the EU. And then, of course, is there some reform measures at the WTO that can be taken? I guess I'm just going to do one other thing, and then we'll go to Paul, who's going to talk about some of the politics of trade. Just give my own thoughts on the Democratic candidates who are running for president. None of them are rabidly free trade, I would say, but I'd say that Biden, Bloomberg, Buttigieg and Klobuchar are more likely supporters of the multilateral system. If moderates like them win, we may see the U.S. rejoin TPP. I think that would be something that you could see. And then the work to improve the WTO and work more cooperatively with our allies. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren are not pro-trade in any sense, but Warren did vote in favor of the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which she saw as a big improvement over NAFTA in the labor provisions. And both Sanders and Warren, I think, are more likely to work cooperatively with allies. Again, my recommendations for Japan would be that they continue to work with the U.S. and the EU to reform the WTO. Important thing is help bring discussions at the WTO on fisheries. This is the issue that it's a big deliverable for the next WTO ministerial, which is supposed to take place in Kazakhstan in June. Positive progress on that, or even a full agreement, and Japan being seen as helpful, I think would go a long way towards helping build some relations with the United States and our trade negotiators, especially because the EU is not clear how much they're going to be helpful on that, since they're actually proposing some new fisheries subsidies. And then lastly, as I mentioned, for the opportunity for Japan, the U.S. and the EU to work together to pressure China on changes that we could see in some sort of plurilateral Phase 2 agreement that would have implications, positive implications for the rest of the trade world. With that, thank you.
Thank you so much for pointing out all those important issues. And Paul, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the U.S.-Japan Research Institute and Johns Hopkins for sponsoring this. Ken, your discussion of the Democratic candidates for president is kind of a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about. I was in Japan fairly recently, about a week and a half ago, and I did a series of talks basically on the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. And I did one at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And they had some technology there on the phones that they could poll the audience. And so after our talk, they asked the audience to vote on who would be the best presidential, or the best next president for Japan. including President Trump and all the Democratic candidates. And Vice President Biden came in first in the poll, which really wasn't surprising. But Donald Trump came in second. And that did surprise me a little bit, given what we know of sort of public opinion polling in Japan. And of course, it wasn't a cross-section in the audience. And then, so I proceeded to sort of ask the audience for some feedback on that as to why President Trump was sort of their second favorite, president with regard to Japan. And China came up quite a bit. The fact that many in the audience liked that, quote unquote, Trump was tough on China. And they had their doubts about some of the other candidates, particularly Mayor Bloomberg, as to what his approach would be towards China. Now, of course, it's overly simplistic to say that Japan is supportive of aggressive policies or the aggressive policies towards China that have been taken on trade and other things by the Trump administration. I think for Japan, it's a difficult situation. I'm going to step on the next panel a little bit because foreign policy and trade are related. This idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that phrase comes from a speech by Prime Minister Abe in August of 2016 in Tokyo. And he said it in part because of sort of his fear of, U.S. withdrawal. The idea was to establish stronger relationship with India and Australia, and also to take sort of a more multilateral approach, very similar actually to kind of a TPP approach. And that was what was meant, I believe, by Prime Minister Abe. About a year later, right, and in fact, it was meant to not be specifically aggressive towards China. The language has changed from free and open Indo-Pacific strategy to vision, right, to make it less sort of aggressive towards China. But when the U.S. adopts it, it becomes more unilateral and at best bilateral, more stick than carrot when it comes to China. Again, putting Japan in a somewhat awkward situation. Japan is, as or more suspicious of China than her neighbors. But at the same time, Japan is dependent economically on China and more dependent on China. Equal number of exports to U.S. and China, but for Japan, many more imports. And part of the stream of production comes from China. So they're in a difficult position. They're afraid of China, but they don't want to alienate China. This is where sort of TPP comes in. It was exactly sort of the kind of approach, I think, that Japan wanted to take, creating, a rules-based international order in the area of trade. And you hear that phrase over and over again from the Japanese government. And we were doing that on trade. I think the Japanese government was confused by the U.S. decision to withdraw from TPP. Overall, they were surprised at the election of President Trump. They didn't expect it. I gave many talks in Tokyo before the election. And I kept telling them, trade's a big issue in Ohio and the swing states, and this election's going to be closer than you think. But, the overall sense was that Hillary Clinton was going to cruise to victory. And, most people thought that. So they didn't expect President Trump to be elected. And I don't know if they took seriously the idea that he would withdraw from TPP. Because if you think about this from a Japanese perspective, Japan doesn't have many changes in power, right? But in 2009, you did have the shift, right, with the DPJ coming in. But you didn't see a huge change in policy with the DPJ coming in. There were some issues, obviously Okinawa and things like that, and the bases that people paid attention to. But overall, it wasn't a huge change of policy, not the kind of thing like the Trump administration coming in and kind of flipping everything upside down. I don't think the Japanese leadership fully understood the power of anti-trade sentiment in the United States. I think I'm in a minority on this, and we had discussed this last night over dinner, but I'm not confident that we were ever really in TPP. Remember, President Obama signed it, but Congress never approved it. And, there is a question as to whether Congress ever would have approved TPP. Remember, just getting trade promotion authority for President Obama was a huge problem with multiple votes in Congress, and I believe it passed in the end by one vote, with hardly any Democrats supporting it. So it's unclear whether it would have ever passed. Japan has had to come to grips with an administration that sees trade in a very different way than past U.S. administrations. Right? In the past, trade was seen as sort of an assistant to U.S. foreign policy. Not necessarily at the center of foreign policy, but helping out our overall strategy. And this was the case from the Roosevelt administration with Cordell Hull, sort of establishing that through, Robert Zoellick, Michael Froman, Rob Portman, all of these U.S. trade representatives. The idea, particularly under Zoellick and others, was you work with your allies on trade. It's a way of sort of strengthening this strategic relationship, and TPP was part of that. I think President Trump and the Trump administration sees trade as foreign policy. And you would have seen that if you watched the debates in 2016. It was interesting. Whenever Secretary Clinton was asked about trade, she would talk about foreign policy. And whenever Donald Trump was asked about foreign policy, he would talk about trade, sort of pivot into that. It is the core of, I think, Trump's foreign policy. Trade is somewhat divorced in the Trump administration from overall strategic concerns. Trade deficits themselves are seen as a danger to national security. And they're a danger to national security whether they exist with our potential foes or with our friends. With our foes, I think trade deficits are seen as fueling military builds-up, for example. I think the Trump administration thinks that the deficit has helped China to finance its growing military power. But with our friends, I think they see it as a risk to self-reliance. That's why you see these 232 tariffs. It's not the fear that Japan will suddenly cut us off from what we need to defend ourselves, but it makes us dependent on other countries. And I think that's how the Trump administration sees this, that our national security depends on our independence rather than our interdependence. Hence, the move to try to untangle sort of these global supply chains. Now, so far the main concern for Japan has been the auto tariffs. I mean, auto tariffs would be devastating to the Japanese economy, particularly with some of the things that are happening now, both with the coronavirus and the raising of the sales tax in Japan. So that's why I think Prime Minister Abe agreed to a deal that isn't a great deal for Japan. And in fact, Prime Minister Abe was criticized in Japan for kind of laying out the Japanese position at the beginning of the negotiations, where Prime Minister Abe said TPP levels on agriculture and no further. And he was criticized for saying, why are you giving up our final position at the very beginning of negotiations? But I think Prime Minister Abe was determined to get an agreement that would take the 232 auto tariffs off the table. There is a question now as to whether those auto tariffs are actually off the table. There's a legal question. First of all, whether President Trump can still impose those tariffs, since the 180-day time period has expired, and there's disagreements over how to read the law. There's been some recent court cases sort of talking about that. Congress, one of the focuses of this panel today, does not have, I think, the same perspective as the Trump administration, including many Republicans in Congress, and particularly with regard to our allies like Japan. There have been 9 or 10 bills proposed already in Congress to limit the president's authority to impose these national security tariffs. Some of the bills are aimed at even 301 and some others, but most of them are focused on these 232 tariffs. And they all kind of say the same thing. First of all, they all want to switch the department that does the review from the Department of Commerce to the Department of Defense, which does make some sense. It's moved around before. It started essentially in what's now emergency management, went to Treasury, then Commerce. So they all sort of want to move it to Defense. But then they disagree. The Portman bill, for example, talks about a joint disapproval resolution. So essentially the president could move forward with these tariffs. They would apply unless Congress disapproved. the other bills, the Toomey bill, for example, from Pat Toomey, before the president could apply the tariffs, you need a joint approval resolution. So, the burden of proof kind of is a little bit different each of those. The disapproval would probably be less threatening to the administration. Overall, though, these things are not going anywhere, right, in Congress. They're not moving, in part, I think, because everybody knows they would be vetoed. And again, you're not talking about a simple majority vote, or 60 votes in the Senate. You're talking about a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress to override a veto. And I don't think that you could get 2/3 of Congress to agree on what time of day it was, much less to override a veto, right? So that's not going to happen. In talking to some members of Congress, though, you do hear that, perhaps auto tariffs would be a tripwire. Something that would at least start pushing these bills forward where they're stuck right now because of fear of that. But again, I don't know whether you can go over the veto requirement. We've been sort of predicting the future here a little bit, and I'm going, I think, too long, so I'll try to conclude. I'm not sure the future is going to be in Congress for trade or in the administration. I think it may be in the courts. You have a number of cases coming up now about trade. And they actually, even some cases that aren't about trade that will affect trade. This is, a very sort of complex area of law. But the movement since 2015 on the Supreme Court, even before President Trump is elected, was to begin to sort of rein in presidential power. Over-delegation is a word you hear quite a bit. The idea that Congress has given away too much power to the executive branch, whether in foreign affairs or in trade policy. And, there's a fascinating case from 2015, the Zivotofsky case, which actually involves passports. And it was a case that the Obama administration actually won. But if you read the actual words of the case, the reasoning of it, it argues that Congress is co-equal in the area of foreign policy and foreign affairs. It actually overturned what was seen as sort of dicta from a case called Curtis Wright, which said the president was the sole organ in U.S. foreign policy. And Zivotofsky says, no, that was just what's called dicta. It didn't count. It wasn't necessary to the decision. And you have more recent cases, Gundy that everybody's talking about, a case about over-delegation, meaning Congress giving away too much to the president. Ironically, the main justices who are pushing this are Trump-appointed justices, Neil Gorsuch, Kavanaugh. So it could be that you're going to see some decisions in the future that are going to basically say, this is over-delegation of trade authority. There were cases back in the 1970s when Richard Nixon did the Nixon shock and the 10% surcharge. In fact, the biggest case involved a Japanese-owned company, Yoshida International, for back in 1975. At that point, it never got to the Supreme Court level, and the courts were basically deferring to the president. Or there's what's called an intelligible principle. Then it's okay to sort of surrender power to the president. But I think the court could be taking a different opinion now, and that's where I would look in the future to how the court kind of looks at this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you. Well, the audience must felt how passionate all of us are feeling about this issue. U.S.-China, U.S.-Japan, as well as Congress. Well, we should, because we don't have much time, we should move to brief discussions here. We laid out all important issues so far, and nobody has talked about National Defense Authorization Act that included to punish Huawei, ZTE, not to buy Chinese drones, buses maybe, and trains, I guess, for 2019 and 2020 Defense Authorization Act. Those are also congressional actions. And it is very important to mention that these days it is very rare to see Republicans and Democrats get together on certain issues and overwhelmingly voting for certain policy act bills and resolutions, particularly regarding China, including Hong Kong and all sorts of things. Charles, first, do you think that Congress can do something using TPA, for example, Trade Authority, or WTO reform, or something like 232, Section 232, or 301, or 201, things like that. Congress has actually basic powers to control all the tariffs and laws. And because the future is really depending on the United States, and Japan relies on it. Therefore, would you please describe the congressional actions?
Well, broadly, Congress has a full array of powers in the area of foreign policy and foreign economic policy. It's very explicit in the Constitution with regard to interstate commerce and trade policy. But even in the area of foreign policy, there are many, many tools that the Congress can use if it chooses to use those tools. And you can go back in history and look at this and see episodes where Congress took the initiative. One prime example would be Nunn-Lugar. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had all these nuclear weapons, and the administration at the time was ignoring that. And this was an episode where a bipartisan group of senators, Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar and others, came together and wrote legislation to create a framework and funding to deal with all these nuclear weapons to create a safer world. That was one example. Another example where Congress asserted itself was with the Taiwan Relations Act during the Carter administration, at a time when there was deep concern about what direction things were going to go with our relationship with the People's Republic of China. Congress was concerned about the relationship with Taiwan and forced through the Taiwan Relations Act. The key is Congress does have a lot of powers, all these trade powers that you mentioned earlier. The question is, will they use them? And that's an open question right now.
I see. Ken, do you see any actions
Well, I think
over there?
I think Charles hit the last point was the salient point. Of course, are they willing to use the power they have? They do have a lot of authority. I'm not sure. Is this on right? Okay. There are a few things to look forward to, though, in the next year. So every 5 years, the United States has a resolution that goes through Congress about withdrawal from the WTO. That is up in 2020. There's not clear what the Trump administration would recommend. It wouldn't likely pass, but it would be a chance for some expression by Congress of any displeasure it has with the WTO. TPA, the Fast Track Trade Authority, has to be renewed in 2021. I think you can guarantee it's not going to look like past TPAs because there's a concern about how the president has used tariff authority. And then on the national security front, which is where you raised to begin with, I believe that you're right. There is a consensus in Congress about some of these issues related to Huawei and 5G and artificial intelligence and a lot of these future technologies. And I think there might even be a concern in Congress that Trump is willing to give up more on those things than even Congress might be willing to do, and they may want to tie the president's hands a bit more so that national security could be protected in the interest if it's recommended by the Department of Defense and other agencies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think one of the interesting problems, right, is that our trade laws were written for presidents who were inclined to lower tariffs. That was, if you look at our history, right, it was that Congress couldn't resist constituent pressure and would push to raise tariffs. The president would be able to do that, would resist the pressure. So the concern was the president would be sort of lowering tariffs too much, not raising tariffs. So you've got a very different president here. When Congress gives away power, it's a bit of a one-way ratchet. And almost nowhere has Congress given away as much power as it has in the area of trade, with 201, 232, 301. There's so many different provisions out there. And once you give away the power, it's awfully hard to get it back again because of the presidential veto. So easy to pass, but once the president has the power, the president can veto attempts to take back the power unless it's sunsetted. And with the area of TPA, you do have sunset provisions, meaning it's going to expire. And I think this gives Congress a bit of leverage, particularly in a second Trump administration, where 232 or sort of reform of 232 would be very hard to get past a presidential veto pen. However, if since it's going to expire, if the president in the next term wants to have trade promotion authority, then he might have to agree to some limitations on 232 tariffs and things like that. So this could give Congress leverage. Of course, the way we understand trade promotion authority is that when you start these negotiations under it, you continue to have it even after it expires. So I think President Trump could sort of argue that even if it expires, he's got, he calls these phase one deals, right? So he's already started the process with these countries, so he still would enjoy trade promotion authority in these areas. It's going to be an interesting thing to look at, I think.
But Paul, you taught. Excuse me. Oh, here. You taught international trade at Waseda for 1 year, last year, actually. And, well, how Japan, for example, or the students in Japan, even Japanese government, should understand about U.S. trade policy formation. It seems that administration has so much power, but as actually Charles can tell, trade policy is all about congressional districts and the elections and local interests. How can we understand the United States and Japan should actually cooperate with the United States?
Well, I mean, I think trade policy and the politics of trade policy are actually pretty similar in countries around the world. You have, everybody's not a winner in international trade. There's losers and winners. And the areas, particularly communities, U.S. states, that are not benefiting or don't see themselves as benefiting from international trade, see their jobs, quote unquote, going overseas, are going to put, pressure on their representatives. In fact, when I taught, I had some students from Japan who were from sort of some of the different rural areas, who were saying, oh yeah, Youngstown, Ohio is a little bit like this place that I come from. So they were kind of familiar with that. Actually, Waseda is such an international university, right, that I had students not just, from Japan, but students from the UK who clearly sort of understood this and tied it to Brexit and the vote on Brexit, that I think you see these similarities around the world, which is why you see sort of the rise of this sort of populism, that communities that haven't seen themselves as benefiting from this. So I think they saw sort of a similarity once you kind of explain the politics. One of the things I did was I went back and showed them what happened to Youngstown, Ohio back in the late 1970s when, they lost over a 5-year period something like 30,000 jobs. And it just devastated the community as all the steel companies closed. And it never sort of recovered from that. And it still looks back at that. I showed them actually some old videos to show them what Youngstown used to look like versus what it looks like now. And so I think it's a good way kind of understanding what the politics is of that area. And again, President Trump didn't kind of invent this. I would suggest that you go back and look at the 2008 Democratic debates between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, particularly the one that took place in Cleveland, where both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton promised to renegotiate NAFTA as they sought votes in the Ohio primary. So this politics has been there for a long time.
I see. Well, it seems like the United States is becoming ordinary nations outside of the United States. When I teach American politics in Japan, I always reiterate that American political power structure is a little bit unique and different because Congress is so strong. And Congress is entitled to make all laws and budgets and tariff to regulate things like that in the United States because of the Constitution. Charles, do you have anything?
Well, it's interesting, and Paul mentioned Trade Promotion Authority, and I was involved in writing the 2015 Trade Promotion Authority legislation that became law, and it was one of the most robust forms of Trade Promotion Authority, empowering Congress. And it's interesting now in watching how the administration has worked. They notified Congress and they followed Trade Promotion Authority all the way through to the very end when there was a need to start negotiating with Democrats, and it was a small specified group of Democrats. It was all done in secret, which violated Trade Promotion Authority. They revised the agreement, without notifying Congress and following the normal notification procedures. So the administration basically used it when it, followed it to a certain point, and when it was not expedient, chose to ignore it. With the Japan agreement, they notified Congress, they sent the formal notification and so forth, and then they just pivoted and decided to do this preliminary agreement, which they did not basically inform Congress at all until after it was signed. That violated trade promotion authority. And with China, they've taken a very narrow Section 301 investigation and expanded it into a full trade agreement. So this administration has chosen to ignore trade promotion authority and trample on Congress on top of using the tariffs. And the administration actually might welcome not having trade promotion authority. And I think it will be difficult to pass it, because I was involved in whipping the votes for passing it in 2015, and we almost didn't have the votes. We had 28 Democrats who helped us to pass it by one vote. It will be a very difficult vote going forward. I would not be surprised at all if we see a gap.
I think, Charles, if I can add,
Yes, please.
as we were discussing it, I was thinking the exact same thing. I think it's highly possible that the president won't seek trade promotion authority, because they've been willing to negotiate these agreements that in some cases stop short of needing congressional approval anyway. So whether they're following it or not, if they don't change U.S. tariffs, for example, or change U.S. law, it's not clear that they would need to go to Congress for that. These micro deals or these phase one deals don't always trip up and need congressional approval for provisions that don't change law. Senator Grassley, actually, there were some rumors in the past couple of weeks that maybe someone, Peter Navarro, or was floating that the U.S. might want to change its bound tariffs. And to do that, it would require a change in law. And Senator Grassley, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, pushed back and said, no, you've got to come to us. So I think it's very possible that they don't seek that new authority. And then that it limits to some extent how comprehensive those agreements could be, but they can reach other agreements, call it a success, and punt to the next administration. Yeah.
Under that circumstances, what will be the ways that congressional members have to influence the administration? They have to, right? Anyway.
Well, first they have to have the will to do it, and that's the big question. And
but each member has each will. Sometimes they're difficult to make consensus and bring it into one.
Senators have more power in that regard, in that they can hold up legislation on a range of things, including nominations, to try to get what they want. But I have not seen Republican senators willing to do that, and even Democratic senators haven't done it in instances where I believe they could be doing it. So in the House, it's more difficult because it's more hierarchical. The leadership, which is aligned with the president on the Republican side, is not going to do anything to purposely try to violate a presidential position. But in a divided government where you have Democrats in control of the House, I'd like to see the Democrats step up and assert congressional power. But I haven't seen it to the extent that you would expect.
And Charles, I think you're right. We haven't seen a filibuster, which is the way that a senator would block legislation, even on unrelated matters, to try to get their will. It's just not. It's not being done anymore the way it used to be. And the Republican Senate has not pushed back on the president. Individual members have, but as a collective, except when I think the threat of auto tariffs was creating some concern, and because that was hitting, I joked with somebody, but there's only a few industries that are in every single congressional district. You have funeral parlors, insurance agents, and auto dealers. So they're in about every congressional district, and they have a lot of influence and power, and so I think you saw some pushback on those issues. But in general, I think they've really not been willing to step up and confront the president.
Senator Charles Grassley worked very hard, I would recall, regarding Section 232. However, it hasn't been successful. That means there isn't any strong will in Congress. However, on the other hand, such as National Defense Authorization Act, excuse me, the sound is gone. It actually had a strong will. Do you think this can last for a long time, even if President Trump is not the president anymore? Because this is so stable in terms of. Oh, yes, now it's back. It is very stable as a law, as an act. Therefore, this act must be very, I think, influential beyond presidential term. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I think to answer sort of your earlier question too, I think if we move into a second Trump administration, remember President Trump will be a lame duck. At that point, he can't run again, and members of Congress are going to start planning right away. Probably, for the next administration, they may feel a little more empowered after that. But going back, I still think don't underestimate the bombshell that the Supreme Court could lay on Congress. If they decide that all these things are over-delegation, if they start to put that in. Because, I mean, you have people on the left and the right that are a little bit frantic about this, because so much has been given away that it would call into question so many laws that it's going to force congressional lawmaking. Because suddenly these laws are all going to be unconstitutional as they're written. And we're going to need new laws out there. And again, that puts the power in the hands of Congress, not in the hands of the president. If you want to be able to have 232 tariffs, national security tariffs, now the question changes. You need to sign a new law because the old law has been held unconstitutional or unconstitutional delegation. So I think that's where this could sort of come from the courts, and this is moving forward. You really almost had the votes in the last case, except Kavanaugh in Gundy had to recuse himself from the case. So and Gorsuch and others kind of sort of made it, Alito even made it clear that he would have voted with the majority to say this was over delegation if Kavanaugh had been on board. So it's pretty easy to see this is probably going to happen, and it's going to really, I think, empower Congress.
Let me mention one other point. It's important to recognize that the current Congress today is very inexperienced compared to what we have seen in the past. Starting in 2006, there's been massive turnover every 2 years within the ranks of the House. And most of the members who have been serving now have only been in a couple of terms, 2 or 3 terms. The leadership team on the Republican side is, I think, both of them are roughly in their 6th terms. So that's kind of unprecedented in a sense. So the legislative experience, the knowledge of how to make things happen is not quite what it used to be. On the Ways and Means Committee, it's the most inexperienced Ways and Means Committee I think I've seen in a very, very long time, which is the Committee of Jurisdiction dealing with trade policy. And most of those members don't really have an in-depth knowledge of trade law and the history of how these things came about. I know this directly because I focused on trade policy, and I have a number of them calling me and asking for advice on things. And even in the Senate, there's been a lot of turnover. And so the Senate is somewhat inexperienced as well. And that may be affecting these 2 legislative chambers' abilities and capacity to challenge the executive branch.
And I guess, Miyoko-san, I would just push back on one thing that you said. I think the precedent set by the National Defense Authorization is not one that's going to carry over in other areas. Yeah, that's right. That committee, as opposed to the ones that Charles talked about, actually has a history of working together across the aisle. Democrats and Republicans in the House have worked together over the years on these bills, which are regularly passed.
Yes.
So there's a limit to the amount of things they could put in the NDA that would have application outside of that. Certainly the things on the telecommunications, they were able to, and Huawei, they were able to maybe do some of that there, and there's probably some other ways they could. But one of the ways they keep that consensus or ability to reach a consensus on the committee is probably by not overreaching into other areas that go beyond their jurisdiction. So I wouldn't read too much
I
into
see,
that
I see.
for other things, except in that space that they've already defined, and other committees have ceded some of their jurisdiction. If they try to go much further, the Ways and Means Committee will pull that back, the Commerce Committees will pull that back, and they won't really be able to get that. And I guess I'm just going to echo again what Charles said. The Republican senators have not really, they've had the authority, the ability to rein in some of the excesses that they may see on the president. They haven't done it. They're worried about their own political futures, and I just don't see that changing in the near term.
I see. Well, in that sense, the tension between United States and China would last for a long time. That's maybe everybody is thinking.
That's
here.
an alignment. I think what you've seen really over the last 6 or 7 years, all the interests have aligned to take a stronger stance against China. Republicans and Democrats, executive branch, congressional feelings about it, but even the public opinion has shifted. In fact, over the past year, there was a massive drop in public approval of China, unlike anything we've seen since the Tiananmen Square massacre. If you go back and look at Pew polling, for instance, sequentially year after year, you can see this trend where public opinion was pretty high prior to Tiananmen Square. I think it was close to 80% favorable in the U.S. It plummeted into the low 30s right after Tiananmen, and then it partially recovered following that into the low to mid 50s, and it hovered there through the 90s and early 2000s until President Trump's first 6 months in office. Polling ticked up into the high 50s. And then after the trade war started, it's now at Tiananmen Square levels, the lowest it's ever been since that time. So, and then secondly, if you look at American Chamber of Commerce surveys that are done every year, you can go back looking over 10 years, you sequentially see a growing negativity. And this last one, some 65% of the companies had a fairly negative view, and were thinking about moving supply chains out and that sort of thing. So now the business interests, which were most pro-China, have also aligned with this negative sentiment broadly in the country.
That's why, as Paul mentioned, Japan is in a very awkward situation. The country has a close commercial relationship with China, but Japan relies on the United States in terms of national security as well as, of course, commerce. Therefore, it's going. Therefore, what is your last comment on U.S.-Japan, I think, impact regarding Chinese relationship?
You guys want to start?
Yeah,
Good.
maybe Paul?
Well, I think overall, I think the good news for Japan is even though you're right, the polling is very negative towards China, it is not negative towards Japan. Also on trade, what's sort of really fascinating is when you look at the polling over the last 10 years or so, and you saw right before the 2016 election, support for free trade was sort of at its lowest in the United States. But since then, it has really taken off. And the polls are very, very supportive of trade agreements right now, virtually every poll that's taken. And of course, you've had a switchover, right, where you've had, it used to be Democrats opposed free trade and Republicans were in favor of it. There's a split. Democrats are much more supportive of trade now than Republicans are, and that's partially sort of anti-Trump feelings. I think since Trump is against trade, Democrats are now for it. But you've really seen a change. But there is a lot of support, so you can imagine that increased free trade with our allies, maybe a new TPP or a new joining CPTPP, would be something that would now have some political support in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just go back to what I said before in my remarks. I think critically in the U.S.-China negotiations, the Phase 1 deal did not deal with these critical issues of intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer. If a U.S.-China agreement were to be reached on those issues at some point in the future, they wouldn't be exclusive benefits just for the United States. That would be very difficult to, it's theoretically possible, I suppose, that China could only confer those rights on the United States, but presumably they would have universal application, that they aren't going to steal intellectual property rights or force companies to be able to have to transfer their technologies. So that's an area where Japan and the U.S. could work together to help pressure the Chinese, as well as the EU could also work with them. And as I was mentioning before, I think Japan and the U.S. and the EU could work together at the World Trade Organization to build a coalition to address some of the critical China issues that are happening there related to non-market economy status, and subsidies that are as big an issue as the appellate body issues that people are focusing their attention on.
Yeah. I think the U.S.-Japan relationship is very strong, and that sentiment's held across the board from the American public all the way up into the halls of government. It's a strong relationship built upon trade, mutual investment, a security alliance, and now cooperation in energy security, which is a newer dimension to it. But, you know, as with any relationship, you got to continue to work at it to maintain it. And the difficulty for Japan and other countries in the Asia-Pacific region right now is that China has now positioned itself as a top trading partner with all these countries. So you have the gravitational allure of China's economy and market and those relationships running sort of counter against the security alliance, and that creates friction. So I think one of the things where we could work together right now, even under the Trump administration, which is not, you know, the best administration to work with on trade policy, would be to look at the area of investment screening and what we could do together with Japan, with the EU, with Korea, Australia, other countries, would be to let's just start sharing data on bad actors to help weed out some of the bad actors in global value chains. In other words, who are the ones, what are the entities that could be shell companies that are PLA organized, that are engaged in IP theft? How do we look at, you know, those engaging in unfair subsidies? If we start at least sharing data on that, it may build out to a more formal working relationship on how do you set standards for investment screening. I think that's doable in the Trump administration. And then the confidence building that comes out of that and working together on standards and maybe trying to cooperate also in some of the multilateral bodies on, you know, standard setting, these things could ultimately lead to a positive outcome long-term with perhaps a new administration in the future to work on advanced trade agreements. I think that's the best approach in the long run, and I think the U.S.-Japan relationship is critical in that. It will not happen without that strong relationship.
Very good and interesting suggestions at the end. So we can have win-win relationship with all those players, actors, and so on concerned. Well, we are running out of time, and somehow invading to national security team. We are very sorry for exceeding time, but we kind of started a little bit late, so it should be okay. And thank you very much for all those panelists. Please give your big hand to those excellent presentations and remarks. Thank you very much.
Okay. We now are going to move on to the security and foreign policy aspect of this. We are going to have to stop promptly at 5 for both of our speakers, but we're delighted to have with us Eli Ratner, who is the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security. And Eli also served from 2015 to 2017 as the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President Biden. Emma Chandlet-Avery is a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, and so that gives her a sort of a unique view into some of the interests of Congress on the issues that she covers, which are U.S. relations with Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Thailand, and Singapore. We're going to start with Eli, who's going to give us sort of an overview of the state of U.S.-China relations. So, Eli?
Great, thank you so much. I thought what I would do is the think tank that I work at, the Center for a New American Security, was selected by Congress to do a major study on U.S.-China strategy, and we just put that out a couple of months ago. So I thought maybe just to start would outline what we described as some of what we thought was the main principles of U.S. strategy, thinking about the Indo-Pacific as well as the global competition with China, and I'll just interlace that with some thoughts of where Japan fits in, because it really is in almost every dimension. I should say the report that we did came out of the Senate Armed Services Committee and was awarded by the Department of Defense, but actually the purpose of the report was to produce a whole of government study, not just a national security focused study. So we looked really across the spectrum. And the report's available online. We've released it publicly. And it starts with 6 what we call foundational principles for U.S. competition with China. And I'll just run through those quickly now, and then we can get on to the discussion. The first principle is to say that the China challenge or the strategic competition with China is an urgent priority for the United States, or that it should be an urgent priority in Washington. That here folks still tend to talk about China as a challenge for the future, and what we described was, if you look at what we view the competition over, which is the future of the regional order in Asia and the international order more broadly, an American and I think Japanese vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific versus a more closed, illiberal order preferred by Beijing, that in many instances the strategic advantages that the United States has enjoyed, that Japan has enjoyed, is narrowing across a number of parameters. And the order itself is transforming away from the kind of vision that the United States and Japan would prefer toward more of a China-led order across a number of different parameters. And just to say, this is something we need to deal with now, that we're entering quite a critical period here, that many of the trend lines that we care about are heading in a negative direction. So very urgent priority. The second principle was that the U.S.-China competition is comprehensive. It's a comprehensive competition. And we, in the report, outlined 7 different, what we called key vectors of the competition: defense, technology, economics, number 3, number 4, diplomacy, number 5, ideology, number 6, governance, and number 7, human capital, and argued that the United States, and of course I think Japan as well, need to be thinking about how to renew our competitiveness in each of one of these domains, that these domains are mutually reinforcing, they're all important, and we need to think expansively about the comprehensiveness of the competition and not say, well, it's just an economic competition or it's just a technological competition. Often you hear people say, well, it's just about this or it's just about that. It's about all these things. And what we need is a more comprehensive and in fact, integrated strategy to put forward an effective policy. And that's a bureaucratic question as well as a strategic question. The third principle, this was from an American perspective, but I think it applies to Japan as well, is that we should really be starting with a conception of renewing American competitiveness. That when we think about the U.S.-China competition, it shouldn't be about them, it shouldn't be about Beijing, it should be about us, it should be about the United States, not just focusing on at home, but how do we think about domestic policy as well as international policy in the context of our competitiveness, and that this is important for a couple reasons. The first being that it relieves us, or let's say it takes the power away from China to be able to dictate the course of what we view as our competitiveness, or what we view as the trajectory of the competition. U.S. policy for far too long was predicated on trying to change China. And even still sometimes with trade policy, we talk about, well, we need to build leverage to convince them to change their ways. And I think at least myself and many of my colleagues believe that we need a strategy for the China that is, not a strategy for the China that we would hope for. And that means focusing ourselves and thinking about how do we compete with Xi Jinping's China, not how do we dream up a better, more liberal, more open China and convince ourselves that we can get there. I think many of us believe we cannot, at least not in the short term. So it's not focused on changing China. It's focused on making ourselves more competitive. And at least here in the United States, it's my firm belief, having spent the last several years in a number of conversations about the U.S.-China competition, that a framing in a context of renewing American competitiveness has much more support, much more bipartisan support than the more narrow confrontational framing that the Trump administration has put forward around strategic competition. So if you talk about renewing American competitiveness, you can bring a lot more people on board, and particularly a lot more Democrats who are not going to be comfortable with as confrontational an approach. So again, focus on American competitiveness. Principle number 4 is simply that allies and partners are going to be absolutely critical for the United States. In all of those domains that I talked about, those 7 vectors of the competition, there really isn't a single one of them where the United States is going to succeed unilaterally. And this doesn't mean that America could or wants to build an anti-China coalition or an Asian NATO or anything like that. I think we're realistic about the difficult position that most countries in the region are put in between the United States and China. But what it does mean is that in these various arenas of the U.S.-China competition, the United States needs to be thinking about what are the particular coalitions that it needs to build, whether it's on technology, whether it's on security, whether it's diplomatic, ideological, and otherwise. And at the root of almost every one of those is Japan. I mean, I think it's clear, and this is not just, I say this not just to this audience, Japan is by far the most important partner of the United States in this competition. And that's a good thing for Japan in some ways, but it also means that Washington is going to come asking for partnership in the years ahead. And I think this is actually one of the ironies, perhaps, of the Trump administration, where there's sort of been a theme or a critique of the Trump administration that the president is very negative toward allies. He's very hard on our allies. The reality is our allies have never had it easier because the Trump administration is hardly asking them to do anything. Whereas if you had an administration that was committed to a more competitive U.S. strategy, was committed to multilateralism, the first flight across the Pacific is going to be to Tokyo. And it's going to be, okay, we want to work multilaterally. We want to cooperate with you. Let's cooperate on all those things we were just hearing about in the previous panel. Let's cooperate on export controls and investment restrictions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, allies are important, and a more multilateral and cooperative United States is going to put Tokyo in a much harder position than the Trump administration has done to date. So I think that's just an important flag to think about for the future. 2 more points. Principle number 5 is that the answer here for the United States is not to defend an old international order. We talk way too much about the post-war liberal order, defending an order against a rising China. The reality is, and this came through very clearly in our report, again, in all these different vectors of the competition, that the United States with Japan needs to be order building. It's about what are the new institutions, what are the new rules, what are the new norms we need to be developing together to manage a number of the issues associated with the China challenge and to build the kind of order that we want. And we need to get out of this conception of having a defensive mindset around a China challenge to much more of what's our affirmative agenda of building order. And it's in part because we're not seeing the kind of integration from China into the old order that we had hoped for. And therefore, the old order itself was largely unsuccessful in a number of ways in that regard. But also because there are a lot of new issues on the table, whether it's artificial intelligence, autonomy, new types of weapons, et cetera, space, cyber, for which there are no existing rules and norms. And so again, thinking in the context of order building, not in defending the old order, is an important way to think about it, and that transforms strategy into being much more innovative and entrepreneurial, and I think that's where a lot of the answers are going to lie. And then finally, the last thing I'll say, just as a principle of strategy, is there's not going to be an easy way out of the China challenge. That the old strategy, the old consensus was predicated, liberal internationalism, it was predicated on the belief that if we just pursued our economic and political interests, that it would create sufficient constraints and incentives on China so as China would not challenge that order. And clearly that has not come to pass. And to deal with the problem now, it's going to cost a lot more than we were hoping it was going to cost. It's going to force us to make trade-offs we didn't have to make. And it's going to force us to have to take more risk than we would want to take on a number of different dimensions, and that's a reality. And so we need to start thinking about how are we communicating that in the American context to the American people, and how are we bringing in a larger set of stakeholders, whether it's civil society, business, universities, a number of other important players who are going to need to cooperate in our efforts to renew American competitiveness on these. And I would imagine it's a very similar situation in Japan, particularly with the business community and other sectors who don't necessarily share as competitive a framework, but will be essential to dealing with this issue set. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eli. And
Great,
Emma?
thanks. Well, I was going to talk about the importance of the post-Cold War liberal order, but I guess we talk about that too much. Just kidding. Thank you, Eli, Dan, SAIS, and USJI for having me here today. Since I do work for the Congressional Research Service, part of the Library of Congress, I do have to offer a disclaimer that what I say does not represent the views of CRS or certainly the U.S. Congress. I'll just offer a few thoughts here. I'm not a China specialist at all. I work mostly on Japan and the Korean Peninsula and a bit on Southeast Asia. But I can offer some thoughts on how I've seen the views of Congress shift on China in the time that I've been here, as well as how it affects my work now. Certainly, I've been here for about 15 years, and the overall, sentiment towards China has plummeted during that time, particularly, in Congress in the last 10 years. When I first got to Washington, there was sort of a built-in lobby for China in some way, which was the business community seeking access to China's market. But now there's a pretty widespread bipartisan consensus that we view China with some degree of suspicion. And it crosses a wide range of issues. Trade practices, IPR violations, human rights, governance. In previous administrations, there was frustration that China didn't help us enough in efforts like fighting climate change or dealing with North Korea or putting pressure on Iran. And in this Congress, we've seen actually pushback even against some of the administration's priorities, not priorities, but lack of emphasis on things like human rights. So we've seen passage of bills on Hong Kong, as well as on the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region. So again, mostly it's been very much a pattern of feeling some degree of threat or frustration with China. Now, what this has meant for my work, particularly, is that there's new support or new attention to our alliances in Asia, which I work on quite a bit. There's concern that China's growing economic and military might is threatening U.S. influence in the region, and there is a bipartisan sense that we need to try and hold together this U.S. alliance system. So I think that looking at the U.S.-Japan alliance specifically, I think that it's very much held in many important ways, but particularly other alliances, what we're seeing with the Philippines now, with them possibly withdrawing from the Visiting Forces Act, as well as the strain on our alliance with South Korea, given the state of our burden-sharing negotiations going on right now, that this is actually really interested Congress. We saw the passage of the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or ARIA. It says something that you even have to pass a Reassurance Act, I think, to some extent. And we've seen a bit of language in the National Defense Authorization Act in the last few Congresses, giving support for the alliances, also putting up, I think, what could be considered some guardrails, particularly in terms of negotiating with North Korea, language about the trying to basically blocking funds from being used to withdraw forces from the Korean Peninsula. There's always disclaimers or, riders and on all of these things, but it does give a sense of where Congress, I think, is at on these issues. Congress has embraced the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific, held hearings on it, and pressured the administration to more fully implement this and resource it as well. What we've also seen is that sometimes this doesn't make it into legislation, but you see a steady stream of letters to the Secretary of State or to the President or dear colleague letters, statements in other ways. And I see a lot of those. They may not make it into the public focus as much. And it's meant that members of Congress, I think in a way that is somewhat unique, get down into details that they otherwise wouldn't. Usually things that are left to the bureaucracies. I mean, things like the Special Measures Agreement, which is the burden-sharing negotiations with South Korea. They're actually, issuing statements on this. I don't think that members of Congress necessarily knew what the SMAs meant in the past because they didn't see it as an area that they needed to get involved in. Similarly, concern about the state of the relationship between South Korea and Japan. That's also garnered a lot of interest. I think Congress was sort of on the front end of this in a lot of ways in raising some alarm bells about it, and particularly the South Korean threat to withdraw from a military intelligence sharing agreement known as the GSOMIA. Again, GSOMIA was not something that people knew about in Congress, particularly before they saw this as really a threat to U.S. interests in the region that may not be given the attention that it deserved from the executive branch. Most of the time, those details were left to the bureaucracies. We do see an interest from Congress when they travel to the region. CODELs going to the region often come to us for briefings and getting a sense of the state of the relationship. I think that usually privately they talk to officials over there and leaders over there about U.S. concerns. And I've seen an interest in Congress trying to be a bit more of another pillar of the U.S.-Japan relationship if they see that relationship as wavering at all at the top. I think that generally speaking, the bureaucracies in Washington and Tokyo have been very close and worked together very closely over a whole range of issues. And with the short staffing we see at the State Department and key positions not filled, ambassadorial positions not filled, there has been some effort by Congress, as consumed as they are by other things, obviously, on the Hill, to try and be a bridge there to the extent that they can. I just also want to mention just briefly that there's possibly a developing tension, and this is getting outside of Congress, but between Japan and the United States, because the United States has emphasized this strategic competition with China. Japan is actually reaching out to China in some ways. They are probably welcoming President Xi for a grand state visit to Tokyo this spring that may or may not be affected by the virus concerns. But they have really got engaged with China and stabilized the relationship, which was really tense before. They still have deep, probably existential concerns about China's power. But right now, maybe because they see the United States as somewhat unpredictable and where we're going with Asia, with Asian policy, as trying to really sort of stabilize their relationship right now. So it's going to be interesting to see, I think, how that plays out. When I'm in Tokyo, I hear from a lot of Japanese, why isn't the United States being more critical of China, on the Uyghurs or on Hong Kong? And we're like, we haven't heard you say anything on this, They're saying, well, we're using quiet leverage, but it's developed into an interesting new dynamic with Tokyo. I will say that there's some other, I think, existing strains on the U.S.-Japan alliance right now. Our positions on North Korea are very different. I think there's some in Tokyo that feel that their concerns are being somewhat marginalized, chief among those the abductions issue as well as medium-range missiles. Obviously, Japan was very disappointed by the administration's decision to withdraw from the TPP, although has exercised considerable leadership in the TPP 11 in the region. And just generally, I think that, alliances don't like unpredictability. They like knowing where you're going, and that's been a little bit unsettling to some in Japan. They're obviously also very closely watching what happens with the U.S.-South Korean burden-sharing negotiations. Japan is due to renegotiate their SMAs with the United States this year. They have a slightly more favorable calendar than the Koreans do, but I think there's a lot of concern that could break into a more open dispute in the year to come. So I'll stop there, but welcome any questions.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask some questions in this session, and we don't have a lot of time, but just a couple things to lead off. There was some discussion in the previous panel about free and open Indo-Pacific and how there are some differences between U.S. Version and the Japanese version. And I'm wondering if I could get the two of you to comment on where you see those differences and the extent to which those might cause any problems in the U.S.-Japan relationship.
Well, I think there's some differences just in how it's geographically defined. I've seen maps that show that Japan thinks of it as a much more expansive realm. I think that there's some, I'm not sure that this is a problem between Tokyo and Washington, but for the free and open Indo-Pacific, I see it as not particularly well-resourced or defined, and a big question mark for a lot of other countries in the region as to where they fit into that. And South Korea, of course, would be one of those. I mean, they don't know where exactly. I mean, they're maritime, but not exactly in the same way that the other countries are in the region. And also, I think Southeast Asia has wondered where exactly they are in there. So I think it lacks definition in a lot of ways. But I know that Japan is pretty pleased that that Trump picked that up as a key area, as a way to define his Asia policy.
Yeah, just building on that, not to answer the question directly, but more in the direction that Emma took it, which is, I think, two sort of prevailing problems with the administration on this concept and why it's been difficult for them, I think, to get traction. One is they haven't really reconciled the free and open Indo-Pacific with their China strategy. And so you read the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, and that portrays one conception of international politics or regional politics, and then you read the free and open Indo-Pacific, and it's sort of the other one. And it's unclear of, sometimes it looks like the China strategy is the real strategy, and the free and Indo-Pacific is the sort of nice diplomatic strategy that they talk about when they go about to the region, and other times different cabinet officials are signaling different types of strategies. So I think the degrees to which those are just existing in different planes is one problem. And then the other, which Emma referred to, and maybe I'll just state it a little differently, is that I don't think they've really reconciled the free part with the open part, because a lot of the times, and it depends on who the crowd is, when the administration is talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific, it's the free part and its values, and it's the Quad, and it's Japan, and the democracies, and Australia, and India, and maybe Europe, and its shared values and common values. And then the other thing is more about openness, and it's Vietnam, and its access, and its commerce, and its freedom of navigation operations. And those are two different things. And so what's sort of the anchor? I mean, I think it's both. That's an existing tension in U.S. foreign policy. It's not new. But they haven't really articulated those two, and people are hearing different things. And obviously, there's a lot of countries in the region, probably including Japan, that aren't particularly interested in a sort of pro-democracy agenda, which is going to fall on its face in Southeast Asia.
And also, since, Eli, you worked for the vice president, and there is a chance that he may win the nomination and perhaps become the president, I'm wondering if you could tell us what President Biden would do differently in terms of China policy. I mean, essentially what you've laid out in your report sounds to me like something that Mr. Biden might adopt, but wondering what you think and how it would differ from the current
Sure.
administrations.
Yeah, well, it's a good question because I think there was a question in the previous panel about what would be the sources of continuity through a Democratic administration. I'm not going to talk about a Biden administration, but maybe more generically about a traditional Democratic foreign policy, though there is variation there, and I can talk a little bit about that. But I think you would hear Democrats, and we haven't had a great discussion of China in the primary debates, so we don't know where all the candidates are, but there have been a number of candidate surveys and whatnot. I mean, I think that the differences in the way a Democratic administration would approach this would be at least three. One would be more focus on investing at home, so thinking about education and infrastructure and research and development and some of these other issues as part of strengthening the United States. And so some of that domestic investment, domestic agenda as part of China policy. There was an interesting article last week or the week before in Foreign Affairs Online. The title was something like the left, meaning the Democrats, or progressives should play the China card. And it's basically making this argument that there's an opportunity to knit together. One of the authors was a close advisor to Pete Buttigieg, the mayor who's running for president. The argument there being Democrats should knit together a domestic and foreign policy agenda around the China issue. So that would be one. The second would be clearly stronger emphasis on allies, seeing allies as much more of a good and something that enhances American power rather than a burden and free riders and all that kind of language. So I think a much more positive approach to allies, and then multilateralism being the other one. I mean, I think TPP, big question mark, but on more traditional diplomatic issues, approaches to ASEAN and the UN, Iran deal, Paris Climate Treaty, all that kind of stuff that are, I think, part of this overall effort. So those would be three that I think you would see across the board. Between the Democrats, there are differences, I think, on trade in terms of sort of how anti-trade they are and protectionist, and on defense and military issues, where you have some on the farther spectrum on the left who are really talking about slashing defense budgets and have a very negative rhetorical approach to the military-industrial complex and these issues. Others who are a little bit more traditional in terms of seeing the United States as having an important role, supporting allies, forward presence. So those are some of the issues I would highlight.
Emma, did you have anything to add
No,
on
I
that?
will just note, building on that there's been sort of frustratingly little foreign policy in the debates that we've had so far. But I think because the president has been sort of openly skeptical of the value of U.S. alliances, it's made its way into like a talking point even for candidates who you can tell are not particularly well versed in foreign policy. But it's like an automatic built-in support for allies because it's seen as a counterpoint to Trump's emphasis.
Okay, we only have 15 minutes left, and I really do want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So why don't we turn to the audience now? And there is a microphone that'll be coming your way, and if you could just identify yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, this is Wathik from Iraq Embassy. I'm asking just if do you see any geopolitical importance to Afghanistan in this competition with China? If it's so, what do you think about the withdrawal, like half of the forces there, or maybe the entire forces?
It's far from my region.
I think the war in Afghanistan has been a huge distraction. I think the United States should withdraw. It should do it in a way that forces more responsibility upon China and other countries in the immediate periphery. So I think it's not a direct. I actually don't think, in terms of the geopolitics of that part of the world, I don't believe the United States should be competing with China everywhere. I think it should be competing with China primarily in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and probably parts of Europe, but not in Africa, farther afield. And Central Asia, I don't think, is going to be a central front in the U.S.-China competition. And to the degree that China thinks about going west, as some have written about, I think that's all for the good for the United States. So I think I've testified before Congress arguing that in this Afghanistan context, the United States should have a policy of burden shifting to China. It should basically hand over large parts of that the security provision to China and let the PLA deal with it. That would be my advice.
So thank you very much, Ira and Watt. And my name is Oya, JBIC, coming from JBIC. And I have two questions. And my first question is, Dr. Ratner mentioned that in short term, China will not change. Therefore, increasing competitiveness of U.S. is very important. And in this regard, my question is, what do you think about using so-called industrial policy? It's a dirty word here in United States, I think, but what's your view on this? And my second question is regarding TPP. And if Democrat win in a presidential election, how probable that the new president is going to return to TPP? Of course, it depends on candidate, but what's your view on this?
I'll take the second one on TPP. Just, I think that that's a huge question mark. I think that it would be difficult, given the politics that we've seen surrounding TPP specifically, to get back to that. We had, both houses controlled by Republicans and a Democratic president who supported TPP. We have a number of Democrats who were ready to support TPP. This is, of course, under the Obama administration, and it didn't go over the finish line. I mean, maybe that had to do with, political calendars and mistaken assumptions about who was going to win that election. But at any rate, I see it as a big lift to get back to.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess maybe it's just the optimist in me. I think it's possible to think about to imagine the United States coming back into TPP, including under a Trump administration. I mean, he was so negative about NAFTA, made basically no changes. The changes he did make, a lot of them were TPP changes, and all of a sudden it's the best deal ever. So I think you could imagine him making modest changes to TPP, renaming it, and United States going back into it. I think that's possible. The logic of it is the same as it was before.
It's music to Abe's ears to hear you say that.
You gotta hope. I mean, without that, I think it's very difficult for the United States to regain its position in the region without being part of a multilateral trading regime. So maybe as a strategist, giving up on that would put you in a pretty depressing position. But I think it's politically possible. And I think you do hear moderate Democrats, including some running for president, saying we need to write the rules, otherwise China's going to write the rules. So we haven't had, thankfully, in these debates, the moderators saying, raise your hand if you would ever consider TPP, because in the last one, because of the politics of the candidates got pushed in a very extreme position on that. And the American people, including Democrats, public opinion polling are still pretty in favor of free trade. Now, that doesn't represent the interest groups that are influential on that, but I don't think the story's written on that as to whether, I think people are too quick to assume the American people are anti-trade or the politics of it are too terrible. I don't think the NAFTA experience, the USMCA shows that's not true. On industrial policy, a very hot issue in Washington now, as you know, and you have unexpected politicians like Marco Rubio, Senator Hawley, Republicans talking about industrial policy in a way that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. I guess my personal view is I don't think we're going to end up with something that looks like Chinese industrial policy, where you have the state picking winners, or a nationalization of a 5G company or something like that. But I think you will see major investments, and it'll be a balancing act between market forces, but trying to solve deficiencies in areas where we need more investment, nor federal investment where the private sector isn't doing it in strategic areas. So, and we already have industrial policy on a number of areas like agriculture and elsewhere. So it actually isn't something that we don't do at all. So I think we'll see a little bit, but not something that would, I think it'll be a balancing act. And interesting, actually, I mean, Emma would have better insight in this than I do, but for all the sort of hot rhetoric on Capitol Hill, it seems like on some of these bills like FIRMA and investment restrictions that it's actually been fairly considered approaches to the legislation. we haven't ended up with, anyhow,
Yeah.
very extreme pieces of legislation, although some have been introduced. Again, despite sort of the mantra that Capitol Hill is very anti-China, we haven't seen some of the more extreme legislative measures that tend to get pulled back to some port of reason. I don't know if you agree with that,
Right.
but.
I mean, I don't track it like I
Yeah.
do, but
Yeah.
it's true, it hasn't been one of the more,
I have to say
outrageous examples.
that, Eli, your optimism on U.S. returning to TPP under Trump is that sounds highly optimistic, but I can't remember who it was, but I think there was a suggestion at one point to get the Trump back in was to change the T in TPP from trans to Trump-Pacific Partnership. I don't know if that would work.
Yeah, thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. Been here about 45 years now. I like so far, Eli. I agree with you. And I like what President Trump said. America first, and this was long overdue for winning some allies, and that's going to make allies, including Japan, stronger because they go independent. More, they're going to grow up. So, in that sense, I like it. Now, I'm going to talk about balance of power in the Asia Pacific. The only way that they can do it, I'm talking about Japan, is for Japan to go nuclear, and they won't. And I'll be mentioning something about that probably not going a few years back. So they should, but they won't. So that's my question there. I'm pretty conservative, as you can see, because because they won't change unless you make them change. Maybe bloody nose a little bit. You're gonna do that. So being nice is gonna go so far, and that's it. Period. Okay, so smile can go long way, yes, but there is a limit to that. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not just saying. I mean, personally, I would, as the from a defense strategy perspective, consistent with the Trump administration's national defense strategy, I think it's quite on point. I think the focus should really be on conventional deterrence. That's where the United States and Japan need to spend their energy. And the question of Japan going nuclear, a lot of people have talked about that and written about that, but the urgency is not around the nuclear weapons balance, it's around the conventional balance, and if we don't get that right, then even if Japan has nuclear weapons, we're rolling the dice. So I'd focus on the conventional side.
I was referring to China.
Yeah.
Trump, during his campaign in 2016, did talk about places like South Korea getting nuclear weapons, something he wouldn't mind. He hasn't talked about that much since, so that's, I think, fortunate. I think we have time for maybe just one or possibly two questions.
Okay, hi, my name is Yasko with Sumitomo Corporation. I have a question for Eli. In relation to what Dr. Nakabayashi said about 5G, I understand, I hear that the national security policy, when that touches upon telecommunications sector, 5G, is not much, there is not much difference between the current and previous administration. It's pretty, how to say, hardcore anti-Chinese Huawei, ZTE are problematic. Now, given the fact that there is not much alternative to Huawei in terms of the level of technology and also the cost, user-friendliness, what sort of a solution did you envision when you were in the White House? Practical solution.
When I was in the White House?
Yes. So I understand that the current administration is basically going overseas and encouraging foreign governments not to use Huawei of course, European friends and others too. But because there is not much alternative to Huawei, what kind of solution did you have back then?
Yeah, I don't know that I want to get into discussions, 4 years ago about 5G. I guess we're doing, at my think tank, we have a whole program around the future of 5G. And I'm not a technical expert on this, but we have a number of people who have written about the alternative of developing an open architecture in the United States, working with countries like Japan and coordinating with advanced democracies to work together to develop what would not be a direct competitor to Huawei in terms of a big company doing the exact same thing, but essentially changing the nature of the future of telecommunications to an open architecture where there was competition over software, but it wasn't a single end-to-end integrated provider with all the infrastructure and software like Huawei's providing. So I think the solution set here is not for the United States to buy Samsung or to start a new 5G company, but to rather change the game. And my understanding is that people who look at this very closely think we can do that in the next couple of years. And buying time by discouraging allies and partners to just go all in on Huawei is the right policy. So the end game here is to slow down while we ramp up with an alternative. And I think that's in the offing if we have, if we're willing to invest the time and resources to do it.
Okay, I think we're basically out of time since both of our speakers have to head out exactly at 5 o'clock. But I think this has been an excellent day, and I really want to thank again the U.S.-Japan Institute for co-sponsoring this. And please join me in thanking our speakers as well.